Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel. Welcome to this live chat. Now, based on a couple of complaints I got, or a few complaints actually from the video before, I've dusted off a part-finished script that it was work in progress, and I've sort of rounded it up and finished it off, and so I'm going to be using this script for most part. I'll be adding some talk over the top. So in this chat, I'd like to talk about the legal environment we are now in, and it's one of politicized law. The rule of law is that all citizens are equal before the law. Due legal process in court is where the evidence of each party is given equal weight by an impartial, independent judge. And the rules of evidence is where all the submitted evidence is tested with the same regard to facts and accuracy, and each side has the same rights to call witnesses and examine the claims made under oath. Has such a legal system ever worked perfectly without a single flaw? Of course not. But it was the standard, the aspirational standard the vast majority aspired to, and I'm talking in terms of lawyers and jurists studying law at university and so on. Today, the practice of law is quite different. Many of those studying law are low-grade, low-quality students, and they're encouraged to think in terms of the law as being a revolutionary instrument to change social outcomes and change the structure of society. So today, the practice of law is quite different from those aspirational standards of due legal process, the rule of law, and so on. The law, has become, I would argue, just one more pawn, one more plaything in the socio-political dystopia of our current times. Times where, for example, climate change activists can block off the downtown area of a major city during peak hour. They can vandalise property, spray graffiti, assault private citizens. And when they get to court, assuming they even do, they get a $20 fine and no jail time. And in one case, I looked at the presiding judge even said, well, I'm going to give you a $20 fine, which is the minimum, because you're doing such important work fighting climate change. A judge in a court of law is saying that. So we've got clearly very activist judges. Now, we can also ask, how did that case uniquely get such a pro-climate change activist judge to hear the case? Because the way it works in courts is that it's the next cab off the rank is how it works. So the next case that comes up, it's the next available judge. But instead, these cases are being held until the most sympathetic judge can be allocated to the case. So that in itself is overturning natural justice and the rule of law and due legal process. And clearly the activists in the Department of Public Prosecutions and the Public Defender's Office, all this sort of thing, they too are shot through with activists at all levels. Antifa goons can run riot, they can commit arson, and all they get is a slap on the wrist. Meanwhile, a straight white male citizen who complains about, say, transgender bathrooms can get jail time. That's the era of madness that we live in. The new legal and very ideological paradigm is where accountability, responsibility, and culpability are related to one's social power. That is, the less is a perpetrator's social power, the lesser should be their punishments for law breaking. The reverse is also the case. Those with more or the most social power, for example, straight white males, those with the most social power should be subject to maximum penalties, but also receive fewer legal protections. That is, if you have more social power, the burden of proof can be reversed on you. You have to prove you didn't do it. Whereas the burden of proof that's required to convict the person with low social power is very high. It needs to be absolutely all-encompassing. All the facts need to be on the table if you're going to convict the person with minimal social power. An example of this can be how say, George Floyd is held up as some hero, even though he was engaged in a criminal act, has a long criminal history, was under the influence of drugs and so on, was resisting arrest and being difficult, and yet he came out as a hero simply because he's part of a so-called and alleged oppressed class. Similarly, just like an independent media, an independent rule of law legal system gets in the way and serves as a constant irritant to the globalist project. It's not just activists that are doing this for the hell of it, for the social change and so on. The law and the due legal process, the rule of law, gets in the way of the globalist project. A court system filled with do-as-you're-told activist judges is okay with the globalist, but anything else is just an annoyance. We need to understand there are two levels of assault on the legal system here. It's not just the punk kids and with the blue hair that are the revolutionaries, not just the activist judges, some of whom, by the way, should be working in a takeout chicken store or as a Walmart greeter. How they ended up with roles as judicial officers is beyond me. And I've met some of them and I'm aghast. The first time this insane socio-political ideological justice came to my attention was around the mid-1990s when a guy in the firm that I was working for at the time, I was a VP, in my high-tech team was being dragged into the family court, the divorce court, for being the alleged biological father of some one-night stand 15 years ago. Now, this guy was pretty critical to the team, and we were at a critical stage of things. And so if he was going to be, if his work suffered or his situation suffered or he got annoyed at all and just decided to leave, this would have had a big impact on what we were doing. So because he was such a critical player in the team, I sort of got drawn into a situation. And he was telling me horror stories about what was going on in this family court. I just plain didn't believe it. I listened to some stuff. You've got to be kidding. There's no way any judge would put up with that. There's no way any politician would tolerate that. That would be it would be all across the media, and those judges would be in serious trouble, and so would the other people, and so on. So there's just no way this could be happening. But I went to see for myself, because the stories were just so incredible. I thought, no, this can't be real. So I friended in the court, in the public gallery, went to see for myself, and it was every bit as bad. It was worse than he had said. And I've had some legal training, so I was able to see some of the things that were being done that he couldn't see, that were clearly injurious to his case and his position in the court hearing. The judge was openly hostile to this guy and to his evidence, and demanded a much higher burden of proof from him than was demanded from the woman. So straight away, this due legal process already, the rules of evidence, is being trashed here along ideological lines. He's the bad guy because he's the straight white male. She's the victim. So he has to satisfy a much higher burden of proof. She has to satisfy a much lower burden of proof. All she had to do was make vague allegations without any corroboration of witnesses or anything. And the judge just accepted that as fact, whereas he had to have all the ducks lined up. And I mean all the ducks lined up for the judge would even consider it, let alone accept it into evidence. And his evidence was routinely dismissed using quite cynical technicalities, while her flimsy, uncorroborated evidence, as I was sitting there watching, was eagerly taken as fact by the judge. Whenever she sort of fell apart under cross-examination or anything like that, and given the obvious lies, they were just ignored. The judge didn't even care about them, and went as far as leading the witness. Okay, no, now say this, now say that. Okay, good, you're fine. And the judge actually leading the witness. It's an outrageous breach of judicial protocol here, and of course, again, the rules of evidence. The man, by contrast, got many hours in the witness box, being constantly harangued and harassed by the judge all the way through. Now, the court was staffed almost exclusively with Marxist, man-hating, family-hating activists, most of whom, by the way, were strident lesbian. We're talking street-marching, placard-waving activists. And such a hiring policy of having that many lesbians and that many man-hating, family-hating people in one place, it just can't be an accident or a coincidence. It's impossible. And why were these angry, men-hating lesbians attracted to this sort of work? Just so they could get back at the oppressor. Now, the purpose of this ideological kangaroo court, to me at least, seemed to be to crush and humiliate this man and probably men in general as they go through that place. It was complete with, say, the court staff laughing and jeering at the man while the court was in session. It was unbelievable. And it reminded me of, being a history buff, reminded me of the Nazi People's Court, the way they'd drag unfortunate Jews in there and jeer and condemn them and shout at them and castigate them and so on. Now, if that is the case, given the amount of people involved in this court in particular who are not Gentiles, let me tell you, have they learned nothing from history? I mean, surely they would not want a repeat of that, no matter who it's directed against. Surely not. I'd never seen anything like it. And I knew then that if this was where the justice system was heading, we're all going along a road to a very dark place. And surely there'd be those citizens, those people, those politicians who want to stop it and put an end to it. But no. Ideologically, however, this brand of jurisprudence held that all men were oppressors and that they should pay handsome amounts of compensation to women who are universally oppressed by men. Now, you could substitute race for gender here, so there's gender in this instance, but we see it playing out along racial lines or along, say, transgender to non-transgender and so on. The fact that this man may not have committed any acts of oppression was, as the activists in the court saw it, not the point, but rather the wider socio-ideological issue that men are the oppressor class and therefore must be forced to pay compensation to women to equalise outcomes. Now, these lunatics in the court, and they're lunatics, these lunatics actually think they're doing good work. They go starry-eyed at the thought of it. We crushed this guy and we've really screwed him over. Wow, we've achieved something positive today. Now, anyone that wants to destroy another citizen along ideological lines for no particular reason, they're the crazy ones, and they're the ones that should be stopped. But they're running the show right now. This madness was once largely confined just to places like these divorce courts, but since then it's spread into all areas of legal practice and all courts. And just look at the judicial activism and handling, for example, illegal alien criminal deportation cases. It's crawling with activists. Also, NGOs that are super well funded are providing lawyers and all sorts of help and assistance to further this reduction and destruction of independent, impartial jurisprudence. Moreover, we're now seeing the concurrent rise of legal ideological theory where when persons of alleged low social power commit crimes, it's because an unjust society made them do it, or they had no choice other than to commit these crimes, or that the crime committing was in some good ideological cause, which therefore somehow makes it okay, such as equalising racial or gender outcomes, climate change, etc. Straight white men, particularly home-owning, steady job-holding whites, are the enemies in this ideology, are the enemies of the people and must be brought to the most rigorous standards of arbitrary accountability, which simply means raising the bar of the burden of proof. And I've seen how this is done. So straight white man, say, is accused of spitting on the sidewalk, and the man can prove that he actually wasn't in Chicago at the time. He was in LA, and he's got 3 witnesses to prove it. The judge said, well, look, I want the plain fare stubs. I want to see documentation that you were in LA at the time, plus the hotel bill credit card receipt. So the man says, fine, I can go home and get that. I didn't know that was the burden of proof I had to meet. No, says the judge, you must produce it right now, this very minute in court. And if you don't, then I won't accept you in LA, and I will say you're guilty of spitting on the sidewalk in Chicago. So not only can the judge determine the burden of proof that the man must meet, but can also arbitrarily determine when and how he must meet that burden of proof, and then have a cutoff point to say, no, you haven't met it, sorry, you did it. Whereas there's no evidence to support the man did it, the judge is just denying the rebuttal evidence. And these are the sort of cynical technicalities that are used in these arbitrary ideological courts. And I believe there are examples of that, say, in the George Floyd trial and others. So these are the sort of devices that are generally being used. So straight white men, and as I say, home-owning, steady job-holding whites are the enemies of the people and must be brought to rigorous standards of arbitrary accountability. If not for what they have done, then for what other white men have done. And if not for what other white men have done, then for what the long-dead white men of years before have done. And if not for them, then white men from hundreds of generations ago. Look, it's ideology, and it doesn't matter. The ideology, the people who push this ideology, they don't care about facts or reality or anything like that, and they will readily accept, hungrily accept any amount of collateral damage in pursuit of vague utopian goals. So today, all across the West, globalist controlled and directed puppet governments, and let's call them what they are, puppet governments, are openly appointing rabid activists as judges, and they're instructed to do so. So when sensitive cases come up, the most suitable activist judge is appointed to hear the case and give the required verdict. The courts are openly used to go after political opponents or any who oppose globalisation or the feeder issues into globalisation. Law enforcement authorities, and we're talking FBI, that sort of thing, and just the police on the street, law enforcement authorities are now routinely used, casually used to crush political dissent and act as agent provocateurs while steadfastly looking the other way to serious crimes. For those who want to take a close-up view of ideological law, take a look at the transcripts, and a lot of them are publicly available, of the Rodney King case in LA in the 1990s. Mr. King's lavishly funded case and lavishly funded defence team did not dispute King's illegal acts. He was arrested. Did not dispute King's illegal acts or dispute that he refused lawful police instructions or that he had previous incidents with police and a rap sheet, and did not dispute that the police needed to subdue him. In fact, really all the allegations that were made in terms of criminal acts by King, or his defence pretty much accepted all of those. That wasn't really in dispute. They tried to turn the case into that the subduing of Mr. King was motivated not by need to subdue him as they would any criminal that was refusing and resisting arrest, but it was somehow motivated by some shadowy form of racism. And given that it was a precedent-setting case, and they were obviously hunting for precedents in this area, the activists and activist groups and organisations poured money into this. We are talking, it was just an open checkbook. And what's more, they somehow managed to get a very, very sympathetic judge who allowed this endless ideological form of cross-examination on the race issue. And this was really the big ushering in of race ideology into court cases. And I don't know why the judge allowed it. In my view, at least, it should never have been allowed, because there's no evidence that there was racism or that it affected anything. Mr. King was arrested and subdued as any other resisting arrest perpetrator would have been. The idea that it was somehow motivated by racism was impossible to prove. Equally, it was impossible to disprove. And it was this gambit, this card that they played, and with some success, given where it all went from there. So let's sum up. We have politicians and judges who treat the Constitution, the rule of law, and the process of law and the rules of evidence as some ideological plaything that exists only to suit their arbitrary purpose and the immediate needs of their political agenda. One of the key reasons the West is, and maybe we should say was, a stable, prosperous and safe place to live is the rule of law, the impartial rule of law and due legal process. With that disappearing and vanishing fast, the return to medieval feudalism cannot be far away. You've been with Tacitus today at your Pushback channel, and thank you for joining us.